2012, and he reopened and started his life over in Latakia. He chose to leave Aleppo and go to government-secured areas like Latakia. Another family had a factory, like a garment factory. They also fled from the militants and restarted their lives in Latakia. I think the issue of refugees outside, of course, is very concerning and something that we should be concerned about. Not often is it talked about all the reasons why refugees are outside of Syria. Some are fleeing because they don't like the Syrian government. Some are fleeing the violence, the fighting between either the militants and the army. Some are fleeing for economic reasons because the Syrian economy has been devastated by 6 years of war and economic sanctions on the country. But I think that when our media talks about refugees, they don't always talk about the reasons why people have left. They're not necessarily all fleeing for the same reasons. And above all, they don't talk about the internal refugees and the support they get from civil society and also from the government. I have a lot more to share with you, but I'd like to close by just mentioning a few things. Some of our prime sources with regard to Aleppo have been the White Helmets, who I touched upon. I showed a photo. They were formed in 2013 by a British ex-military officer. They received funding from the US, UK, and other Western nations. Apparently over $100 million. They say that they're neutral rescuers. They work exclusively in Al-Qaeda and other militant faction areas. And they say they're neutral, but carrying weapons and posing with Islamists is not exactly neutral. Now, some have argued that, well, these were prior to becoming rescuers, but there have been Facebook profiles showing the White Helmets recently carrying weapons and at the same time posing as White Helmets. I want to show one clip, very quick clip. I won't show it all, but you'll get the sense. So there's the guy in the film. Some people have suggested this was submitted to the mannequin challenge. I wasn't following that whole craze, so I only belatedly came across this. However, whether or not it was created for the mannequin challenge, I don't think so, because my understanding of the mannequin challenge is that people are active and then they freeze in their actions to act like mannequins. This one starts out with frozen and then action. One theory is that the reason it starts off frozen is that so the photographers on site can get their images that then go out to corporate media. But whether or not that's the case, the point is they've created a rescue scene that looks very realistic, and here's the guy being rescued, standing on legs that look to be crushed. This is not to say that every single video coming out of opposition sources are fake, but it does warrant people being very skeptical or questioning the media that they're seeing. For example, I'll close in a moment, but in 2014, there was a video called Syrian Hero Boy. And I wasn't aware of it at the time, only recently came across this, but apparently people believed that this boy in the video was saving his younger sister, who was presumably under fire by the Syrian army. And even the BBC, this analysis I came across recently, they said, well, you know, some people are saying this video might have been staged. It's possible. So the BBC was saying, yeah, it's possible the video was staged, it does happen. But their expert said, but we know it's in Syria, and we know it's in a regime area, because the barrel is painted with the Syrian army flag. That's what she said exactly. Well, it's the state of Syria flag, for one thing. And later it was proven that it was, the filmmakers themselves from Norway admitted it was filmed in Malta. So you have the BBC, which is a renowned world authority on issues, affirming that this is in Syria, and it turns out it's in Malta. More recently, in December in Egypt, a group of filmmakers were arrested for staging videos that were purporting to be in Aleppo. So what I'm saying is question the media you're looking at. It might be true, it might not, but don't take everything you're seeing as truth. Even myself, corroborate what I'm saying. Corroborate what I'm saying about Syria being secular, or about the protests from the beginning being armed. Not all of them, but some of them. The Dara, where the so-called revolution kicked off, it was later learned that the Al-Omari Mosque in Dara was had a weapons storage. This has been documented. Even the sheikh in that mosque admitted it, and I spoke with somebody from Dara who also corroborated that the early protest had protesters who were firing on unarmed security forces. So one other example I'll give is to a mother and her son in Latakia, who said, sorry, I just want to find one thing for you. A mother and son in Latakia who said to me in April 2014, there was a report in the LA Times which was saying there were protests and the Syrian army was crashing down violently in the protests, and she said she had been out doing errands that day and was in every area that was mentioned in the article by the LA Times, and none of the things they were reporting was true. It's her word, but when you get enough testimonies like that, it has to make you question how much of what we're seeing is true. There was an Al Jazeera cameraman named Ali Hasham who resigned because Al Jazeera would not air his footage, which showed in May 2011 armed men or militants crossing from Lebanon into Syria. And he was told to forget, Ensi Nofi Musalahin, forget that you saw armed men. And he resigned due to that. There are many instances of the media misleading the public, and I don't know if it's necessary to remind this audience of the incubator babies act by the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, but this is not a new thing. So I just want people to think critically and check many sources, not your standard corporate media, but check many sources and corroborate. The last thing I want to do is just cite from the Hands Off Syria coalition in the US. They issued, and I can get this for anybody who wants it, but they issued a flyer. They're basically a coalition of various anti-war, anti-imperialist groups that came together because they don't believe in the regime change operations. Some of their main points were this policy of regime change in Syria is illegal and in clear violation of the United Nations Charter. They mentioned that the EU sanctions and the US sanctions, how they've destabilized and devastated Syria in every aspect, their economy, their health sector, everything. And they said only the people of Syria have the inalienable right to choose their leaders and determine their character of government free from foreign intervention. And that's, to note, the Syrian people and government have the right to choose which states they want to ally with. It's not our choice. Some of their basic demands were an immediate end to the US policy of forced regime change in Syria. Also, an immediate end to all military, financial, logistical, and intelligence supports by the US, Nato, and their regional allies. And an immediate end to the economic sanctions on Syria. Just in closing, I want to show you one thing quickly. According to the US, the designated terror groups are ISIS, of course, and al-Nusra. However, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, please, the group Ahrar al-Sham has not been designated by the US State Department as a terrorist group. Yet in their own Congressional Research Service reports from 2015 and 2014, they list Ahrar al-Sham as a terrorist group. So this is one other issue, the issue of lexicon, of the notion of moderate rebels. I'm going to show you this last point I want to make, and again, these are graphic. These are examples. This is an early example of a moderate. This one, the BBC actually interviewed. His name nom de guerre was Abu Sakr. They interviewed him and they humanized him, saying, "What compelled you to bite into the organ of the Syrian soldier?" I mean, there's no excuse for cannibalism, whatever his story was. But the BBC basically wanted to humanize him and make us think that these terrorist acts, these heinous acts committed not only by al-Nusra and ISIS, but also by the Free Syrian Army and Ahrar al-Sham and Nuruddin Azinki, these heinous acts are somehow acceptable. This is the one. Now, one other point I want to make about moderates, the group called Nuruddin al-Zinki some months ago captured a Palestinian boy. They tried to say that he was a 18 or 19 or 17-year-old militant. By all looks, he seems to have been 12 or 13, very weak. He had some sort of medical tubing in his arm, and they methodically sawed his head off. Now, even if he had been a fighter, they sawed his head off. And the US government basically said, oops, it happens sometimes. And Nuruddin al-Zinki has not been designated a terrorist group in spite of that heinous act. And in fact, some of the photographers who have come to renown in Syria, for example, the man who photographed Amran, the boy sitting in an ambulance, he can also be found taking selfies with the same Nuruddin al-Zinki militants that beheaded this boy. So there's a lot to be said about who are moderates. My perspective is I respect the Syrian people's right to choose their own future and their sovereignty. I'm opposed to US imperialism in Syria. If Syria wants to invite their allies to help them defend themselves against some of the worst terrors in the world is known, that's their prerogative. It's not relevant what my opinion is of the government. What's relevant is the Syrian people's opinion, and even Western media will recognize that whether or not we like their government, the Syrian people have elected them, and they want him, and they see him as the solution to peace. And where I've been in Syria, people say we want Syria to go back to how it was prior to 2011. So, I mean, there's a lot more that can be said, but that's a huge indication of what Syrians want. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Eva. I wish we had more time, but we've got I know we have questions coming, and in that vein, I'm going to ask Ken Stone to come up. He's got a few announcements, but while that's happening, if you have a question, get one of these cards from any of our ushers, and then they'll bring it up, and we will. Eva will respond to your comments and questions. So, Ken,
how's it going?
All right. As I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert, so there are going to be questions that I cannot answer. I'll answer to the best of my ability, and there are some Syrians in the audience, so I would encourage, if I may, I don't know the protocol, if Syrians in the audience can also speak, but I'm asked how many Christians or other minorities are on the side of the NATO-supported rebels. I can't give a direct answer to that. My feeling, based on visiting various areas of Syria, is that there's almost none, at least Christians and other minorities. However, I cannot definitively say. I would say it's very small, if any. In the rebel-occupied territories, what percent of the population support the rebel? That's a good question. Also, I can't give an exact percentage, but I can say again, in East Aleppo, which the UN, by the way, had been saying for years, or the last couple of years, they kept referring to East Aleppo as a population of 250,000 civilians. And when all of Aleppo was secured, out of that area, according to sources on the ground who visited refugee reception centers, and also taking into account the number of militants and their families and supporters that did go to Idlib, 110,000 came out of those areas. So even if we're generous and say 150,000 came out of those areas, okay. Even if you were, okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm not prioritizing anybody. Which one?
This is the second one.
Okay. So even if you were to assume 150,000 came out,
What about this
yeah,
feeling? Yeah, me
thanks.
too, yeah.
Where's the other 100,000? And this is an important point, because when you ramp up the numbers, that means you have more people to be concerned about. There were not 250,000, but in those areas, I mean, certainly they had supporters, and certainly there were people that wanted to leave but couldn't leave. I would highly encourage people to look at some of the work of Vanessa Beeley. She's on Facebook. She contributes to 21st Century Wire. I know her personally. She's also not a paid Russian agent. She's simply somebody doing her best to report what she's seen and being told in Syria. And she was actually in Aleppo in December when it was being fully liberated. And she did take many harrowing testimonies of people that came from East Aleppo. So I would really encourage you to look at her reports because she's trying to give the Syrian voices a platform, and I think that's what we all want. Has the Assad regime committed war crimes? How do you rationalize supporting a regime that millions of Syrian refugees claim have committed atrocities that led them to flee the country? That's a good question. I mean, no army can be innocent of committing crimes. No army in the world. The US Army, the Canadian Army, the Syrian Army. Is it a policy? I would beg to differ that it's not a policy. Syria is fighting terrorism. Crimes may have been committed, I cannot say, but they may have certainly been committed. In fact, it's possible, very possible. As far as supporting a regime that millions of Syrian refugees claim have committed atrocities, well, there's many millions more that claim the contrary. And by and large, what I'm supporting is the Syrian people and their right to choose their own government. My personal opinion of the government is of no importance. Again, what I've shown you is testimonies and facts based on what I've seen in Syria. And by wherever I've gone, and even speaking with Syrians in US and Canada and other places, and Lebanon, I spent many months in Lebanon, interacted with Syrians there who are not refugees but left Syria to work and support their families living in Syria. The majority, in my opinion, support the government. So, yeah.
Yeah, we just, before we're going to suddenly cut off in half an hour. So, first of all, this is a free event, but the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, we basically rely on free will donations. If anyone feels like supporting the cause, because each event does involve a little bit of money, Ken will be going around with a... oh, okay. What do you, I'll give it to you.
Thanks, Doug. Good evening, brothers and sisters. I'm here tonight to make a pitch to you to amplify the voice of Eva Bartlett and the sponsoring organizations of her cross-Canada tour. And those sponsoring organizations are the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, the Syria Solidarity Movement.org, and the Canadian Peace Congress. What we're doing here tonight is challenging the mainstream media consensus on Syria. In Syria, the tide has turned in the information war as it has on the war on the ground. For almost 6 years, journalists working for the mainstream media, especially those who get the lucrative foreign assignments, they could sit in a fine room in Lebanon or even in London and just cut and paste completely unverifiable information from opposition sources inside of Syria or in Turkey even, such as the White Helmets, the so-called Free Syrian Army, or the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is one guy in a tailor shop in London. And they could have their articles published in thousands of newspapers around the world. But now we have people like Eva Bartlett, Vanessa Beeley, and other independent journalists that Eva mentioned during her talk, going to Syria and seeing with their own eyes and hearing with their own ears what's really happening on the ground, and taking testimonies from the Syrians themselves and putting them on the social media. It used to be that you'd have to wait until after the war was over to find out about the truth about the pretext that started the war. Eva mentioned the Kuwaiti incubator baby scam. And that was a lie, but we didn't find out till after the war. But that lie managed to persuade the US Senate to vote on behalf of the senior George Bush, his first Gulf War. And that Gulf War started a chain of horrible events which goes on today, 25 years later, and it's happening right today as we're sitting here in the city of Mosul in Iraq. And that's only one example. I'll give you one more. I'm an old school teacher, so I like to see what my students are thinking out there. How many people are familiar with the Gaddafi Viagra for the African mercenary scheme? Well, there's only a few, but that didn't happen that long ago. That was 6 years ago. In 2011, when the Queen of Chaos herself, Hillary Clinton, came up with this lie that Muammar Gaddafi was giving Viagra free to his troops, including a large body of African mercenaries. Well, he didn't have African mercenaries. There's a lot of black people who used to live in Libya, and there were a lot of black migrant workers who used to live in Libya. And actually, it turned out that Muammar Gaddafi didn't have any Viagra to give to the troops, but it was good enough to for Clinton to turn UN Resolution 1973, which is the no-fly zone resolution, into an all-out attack on the Libyan state, which destroyed Libya. It's a failed state today, and hundreds of thousands of Libyans have climbed into flimsy boats and tried to make it to Europe, part of the refugee crisis we face now. But today, thanks to independent journalists like Eva Bartlett, Vanessa Beeley, the propaganda smoke screen gets exposed during the war. Eva mentioned the white helmets, which were a gigantic scam. They claimed to be fiercely independent, yet they received $40 million from USA and another $40 or so million from the British government. And then other NATO governments gave them money as well. They tried to get the prize at the Toronto International Film Festival. We picketed. They didn't win the documentary prize. They tried for the Nobel Peace Prize, and they were exposed so well by Eva, Vanessa Beeley, and the others. They didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize either. The president of Colombia, who ended a 30-year-long war, or maybe it's 40-year-long war, got the prize instead. Another scam that Eva and Vanessa and the others, independent journalists, have exposed on social media is about the unmitigated disaster of the liberation of Aleppo, according to the Hamilton Spectator. The Hamilton Spectator, with this lead editorial, says it's a tragedy, it's the world's shame, it's an unmitigated disaster, and they have Putin standing there with his arms up to his elbows in blood. But the journalists on the ground showed that, in fact, the operation was handled very professionally by the Syrian army. And I don't have to tell you that. You could go live onto our RT, Russia Today, if you're not worried about your mind being hacked. And I was watching it live, and I saw the Syrian army provide hundreds of buses for these terrorists from Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, get on the buses with their families and their light arms and be bussed out of Aleppo to Idlib province, where they could continue their mischief and their deadly doings. And nobody was tortured, there were no mass killings, but the 110,000 people that were being held as hostages by the militants who left on the buses were freed. And the people of Aleppo were dancing in the streets. They were dancing in the streets. But you wouldn't see that in the Hamilton Spectator.
And celebrating Christmas too.
And they celebrate, that's another good point, Ray. They were celebrating Christmas for the very first time in 5 years in Aleppo. The Christians were out with Christmas trees and Santa hats and everything else. They wouldn't have dared. They wouldn't have dared while the terrorists were there, because they would have been beheaded. So this kind of investigative journalism done by Eva Bartlett is not free. She's not receiving any rubles from RT, and she's not receiving any Syrian pounds from Sana, the government broadcaster in Syria. Eva works on a shoestring. She can't afford a car. She doesn't have a cell phone. She has to rate. Well, sorry.
This is a gift. From my brother.
And she doesn't have a regular income. To go on these tours, she has to go to friends and raise the money to get the airfare to get there. So I'm making this pitch to raise the money beyond the cost of this meeting for Eva to go back to Syria, if that's in her plans, and dig up more of the truth for you and other people in Canada. We're also the organizations that are holding this tour are also planning to have a fact-finding Canadian tour. A tour of Canadians go over in the next few months to Syria. And it will be hosted in Syria by a major trade union. If you're interested, please come and see me after this meeting. But that part of the money will be going and might be able to help you to be part of this tour. So I'm saying if your whatever your contribution you can make, large or small, will help continue to bring the truth about the war in Syria to Canadians and break the MSM stranglehold on the news. Thank you very much. Carly will be going around with a box on that side of the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And just one more announcement before Eva starts again handling the questions. Mark Tagliano is right over by the wall there. One of our ushers. He was in Syria just early fall, wasn't it? September, yeah. And Mark has a book that's on global research, if you would like to read about Mark's own experiences on that. So anyways, let's get back to the questions. We'll see what we can cover in the time remaining.
Okay, I'll do my best to keep it short. I just want to make two remarks quickly. One, Ken was talking about media, or sources that media relies on. I touched on the white helmets. He mentioned SOHR. There's also the Aleppo Media Center, which is funded by EU states, so it's not exactly an impartial source. And of course, there's unnamed activists that are always unnamed. The other thing I wanted to touch on, he mentioned a Spectator article. There was recently a Spectator article in which the journalist asked me a number of questions. We spoke for 15 or 20 minutes. She included a fraction of what I said. And she also, in my opinion, plagiarized Channel 4, because in her third paragraph it reads almost exactly like Channel 4, in which it says Bartlett writes for Russian state-owned media, a blog for Russian state-owned media. So I thought, well, isn't that interesting for a journalist not to check the actual source that's linked to in that blog, and that source goes back to the section that says op-ed, or op-ed. So it's not exactly a blog, and as I mentioned, 70 other contributors. I didn't mention something, and I will right now quickly. In Damascus, there's a district called Barzeh, and Barzeh has been under a sort of truce since, I can't remember offhand, maybe 2012 or 2014, so don't quote me on that. But the fact is, it's a district of Damascus in which FSA militants still hold weapons, but they've pledged not to use them against the people or the army. And I've gone through that district twice it's a faster route to if you want to go towards Homs or towards Malula. And the last time I was coming through it, our car was actually sniped at. And I was with somebody who knew about what it sounds like when you're being sniped at. And in summer 2014, I was sitting outside the old city, leaning against the wall, sitting in the shade, and a sniper from Jobar also fired some bullets towards us, and the people that were sitting in the grass jumped up and ran. So reporting from government secured areas is not without its danger. In addition, the mortars, the car bombs, etc. I went to a district of Homs called Zahra a couple of days after it had been car bombed, and I spoke to the people there. And at any point, these types of bombings can occur pretty much at any time. So just wanted to mention that. So somebody asked how I learned Arabic. How did you come to learn Arabic? First of all, I don't speak perfect Arabic, but I'm conversational. When I do interviews with people, I always record it and double check that my understanding, and I get a perfect translation or an accurate translation. So if the question was in relation to that, I do always get somebody to accurately translate, but that said, I can usually understand almost all of what's being said if spoken in standard Arabic, if spoken in colloquial Arabic, not standard. And I taught myself living in Gaza and interacting with people. Okay, the other reporters, I think this is in relation to the November trip to Aleppo maybe. The other reporters that saw and heard what you did their reports jive with yours? Did they say what the militants were doing to civilians? So that's a really good question. Actually, I was quite surprised when I read the LA Times article. That journalist did a decent job. I thought he was fair. He reported that what I failed to mention in the talk, by the end of the day, 18 people were killed and over 200 were injured, including many in critical condition. And he did report fairly that militants had bombarded the city and targeting civilian areas. I would have to say I was surprised, and pleasantly so. Ann Barnard of the New York Times reported some truth, and then she threw in a quote from the SOHR that regime planes had bombed other areas of Aleppo that day. So she threw in, and she also implied that the bombings that day were not normal. I can't remember how she phrased it, but she did imply that this was not a normal activity when we'd just been told by a number of people in Aleppo that on an almost daily basis for years they've been suffering from these bombings. Action, ask Canada to stop economic sanctions against Syria and give aid instead. Absolutely. People can refer to Iraq and the immense destruction and deaths, like what was it, 500,000 children that died as a result of these sanctions. Economic sanctions do not target the government, they target the people. And the people of Syria are suffering as a result of these sanctions. They are criminals, so absolutely any nation participating in sanctions has to cease, should cease. And also Canada should reopen its Syrian embassy. I mean, Syrian people have no voice here. Why does NATO want to destabilize Syria? Can you actually speak to Syrians? Do you need an interpreter? Who funds your trips? Okay, who funds my trips? I do, or I fundraise, not the Syrian government. Can you actually speak to Syrians? Yes, I just touched on that. And why does NATO want to destabilize Syria? Again, I'm not an expert, but you can refer to the PNAC documents talking about the Project for a New American Century, talking about how the US essentially wants to have control over these regions in the Middle East. It's to do with resources, it's to do with depriving others of resources. The Syrian Hezbollah-Iran alliance, the fact that Syria is at war with Israel and has been very supportive of Palestinian rights and the Palestinian right for sovereignty. There's many other issues. The Greater Israel Project. Again, these are all things that you should Google and look up yourself. But bottom line, it's not about democracy, freedom, or human rights. Look at the people they're supporting. Look at the Wahhabi-backed so-called moderates of the Alouche clan. You have Mohammed Alouche, who's who has been taking part over the years in so-called peace talks, and his brother Zahran Alouche is well known for putting humans, men, women, and children in cages in Ghouta. So, I mean, these are the moderates that the West likes to ally with. And I don't think I need to tell people about the Saudi regime's, atrocious human rights records. Give a history of the Syrian border since 1890 and historical events. No, it's a great question. I just can't do it. But I would encourage you to read the article by Stephen Gowans, The Revolutionary Distemper That Wasn't. Just Google his name, Stephen Gowans, or What's Left is his blog. An excellent, very well-sourced article with a lot of historical context. I'm not laughing at the question, honestly. I'm just laughing at my own ignorance. I can't answer it. But it is a very important one. I can understand the agenda of the corporate media in its reporting on Syria. Why would Democracy Now!, thank you, contribute to this reporting by claiming twice in November 2016 that Russians and/or Syrian government forces were responsible for bombing hospitals in eastern Aleppo? Thank you. Democracy Now!, this is a good one, because I only touched on corporate media, but I usually do also mention and highlight Democracy Now! The reporting on Libya was atrocious, and the reporting on Syria is atrocious. They consistently host almost exclusively